Rocket scientist Wernher von Braun remains a controversial world figure even today. There's no doubt about it. 36 years since his retirement from NASA and almost 29 years since he departed planet Earth, which he considered a spaceship, at the age of just 65. Warts and all, this German-born engineer and scientist, physicist, and one-time enemy of the United States and its allies, this former card-carrying Nazi party member, still stands as an intriguing, dynamic, very complex human being. I'd like to share with you some lessons learned from his example and from his life experience, and after introducing him a bit further to you. You may clearly notice I'm using some notes, unlike these other presenters who did so well without them, and I'm flying with no PowerPoint presentation, but a very bright and very seasoned lady reporter told me, a newspaper reporter many years ago, Bob, writers should never, ever speak extemporaneously. That they tend to just go on and ramble all over the place, and then when they get done, they think they can come back and edit and clean it all up, and it'll be all right. Well, I took her advice, and she was quite right in cases of people like me. And before I do continue, I want to extend a large good luck on NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which, according to the last newspaper story I read, is supposed to go into Martian orbit tomorrow. So, Godspeed on that project. Wernher von Braun was the superstar of space of his day. He had a passion for life as well as for rocketry and space exploration, and it shone through in all his work and in all his communications. He helped turn much of his lifelong dream into reality, beginning in Germany and then for fully half of his life in America. Just being around Dr. von Braun was enough to give one an inferiority complex. He did not appear to seek to do that. It mainly just happened, although he did hold back very little. He was anything but a shrinking violet or a wallflower. And he did, however, seek to be on very friendly. He was very approachable and accessible in most situations, to be on friendly speaking terms, generally with people at all levels, engineers, janitors, technicians, bureaucrats, politicians, secretaries, even journalists. Hard to believe. He knew and he remembered the names of many people within his sphere. This was the director of NASA's George C. Marshall, a great enemy of his in World War II, Space Flight Center for the first 10 years of its life. And earlier, he was the civilian technical director of the U.S. Army's Space History Making Ballistic Missile Agency and other Army agencies, all at Redstone Arsenal for 20 years in all. And before that, of course, he was the German Army's very young missile technical chief. I began getting to know Dr. von Braun casually in 1957, which tells you how old I am. I was not a child then. The year the space age began, of course, as a very young and very green daily newspaper reporter in Huntsville. We got somewhat better acquainted over time in Rocket City, USA, and in his final years with NASA in Washington. He was an impressive fellow. I tried very hard to maintain a journalist's objectivity, and still do, about him, and keep a professional distance during the years we lived in the same town. But he was still most impressive, although anything but infallible. He was not that. He became all the more imposing to me later in death through about 7 years of interviewing for and otherwise researching and writing this Dr. Space biography published by the Naval Institute Press. He was truly a genius as a technology leader, as a visionary, as an inspiring presence to his various teams of various sizes in wartime and peacetime and during the Cold War. Here was a genius, pardon me, at human relations, with in addition to this technical brilliance. And he had a great breadth of technical knowledge. People all around him who were specialists in certain fields had a greater depth in their discipline, but he was pretty much unmatched as a generalist and in the breadth of his knowledge. He was, as I said, a genius at human relations, not flawless about it, but still quite good at that. He had a hyperactive, almost compulsive sense of humor, and he used it in countless ways. He lightened the mood for his board meetings with his lab directors and others of the inner circle there, and it was a quite extensive inner circle, with a well-told joke or two with the boys, often risque, and if it had a space angle, all the better. At the launch site, he would break the tension with some witticism, and he would warm up his 1950s audiences for speeches outside the South by apologizing for my accent, as he would say. Then he would grin and add, "I'm from Alabama." He had quite a mixture of accents, the German, he lived in Texas for 5 years, and then Deep South Alabama for 20 years, and then Virginia. And his accent was from all over. But he was, as Hamlet said of Yorick, a fellow of infinite jest. He just loved to exercise his sense of humor all the time and to enjoy other people's senses of humor. He would protest, "I've never considered myself a genius, and my wife is always ready to attest to this fact." And in the 1950s and 60s, when others might suggest that its rocket and space success record showed that his team's German nucleus was smarter than everybody else, he would demur. It's not, and I'm quoting, "It's not that we're geniuses, it's just that we old-timers have been working on these things so long, we've had 12 more years to make mistakes and learn from them." And I think Gus touched on that before. John, and mistakes can be very instructive. John Glenn told me in a 1999 interview, and he wrote along these lines in the foreword to my book, that his longtime friend, von Braun, was a modern Renaissance man who had a, quote, curiosity about everything around him, unquote. And that von Braun had a range of intellectual interests and hobbies, for that matter, as vast and diverse as the universe. Von Braun, born in 1912, an instant baron as the middle son of aristocratic Prussian parents, was a fast-talking, fast-walking bundle of contradictions. Brilliant as a youth, he got distracted and flunked math and physics at one point. He and a friend were building an automobile, and this was like, 14 years old or something, building an automobile in his garage, and he let his studies suffer a little bit. Sent off to boarding school and turned on academically about the same time in his early teens by visions of rocket ships into space. He earned 2 engineering degrees, mechanical and aeronautical, plus a doctorate in physics by age 22. Hell, some of us did really well to get 1 non-technical degree by the age of 22. He had been named earlier the civilian chief of the German Army rocket program 2 years before that, at age 20. And by age 25, he was the civilian technical director of the Wehrmacht side of the Peenemünde rocket R&D base on the Baltic Sea coast. The Luftwaffe had the other side at Peenemünde. And it was, and this ultimately built up to a 10,000 or 12,000 person facility toward the end of World War II, if you count thousands of Polish and Russian POW forced laborers that they had at the site there. And the SS later brought in some other slave laborers at that site. It was unheard of for, at that time in Germany, for anyone of that tender age of 25 to be in such an authoritative position as von Braun was. This paradox of a bold, starry-eyed space cadet was one of the most ultra-conservative of engineers anywhere. He was inclined to move ahead only in very safe and measured and incremental steps. He insisted on testing, and testing again, down to the last component of the last subsystem. Admiral Alan Shepard, a von Braun admirer, nevertheless went to his grave believing that he would have been the first human in space if only von Braun had not ordered just one more chimpanzee test flight of Mercury Redstone. That allowed the Russians to put cosmonaut Gagarin into orbit just days before Shepard went up, and to beat America once again in the space race of that era. But Shepard did have a safe flight aboard a souped-up U.S. Army Redstone missile, as did Gus Grissom shortly thereafter in their suborbital arcing 15-minute flights. Additionally, playing catch-up with the Soviets with a very energized, high-priority program wasn't all bad either. Disney and von Braun were real pals for a lot of years. I got to meet Walt Disney at a reception that von Braun threw at Marshall Center. And my wife, Barbara, who's attending some of these events in this conference, was there too. And he said something very flattering to her. And who is this beautiful young lady? And she was so taken aback she could not remember her name. She knew it really well, but here was this icon here that just charmed her to death. And she wasn't with von Braun all that much either, so she was just stunned. She recovered and later remembered her name. But von Braun was not only a friend. Disney came to Huntsville a lot to see von Braun, and von Braun went to California. Of course, he always was visiting contractors, and he'd slip over to the Disney studios to do some of these things. But he was a consultant. In addition to these television films that showed in prime time, to the Disney people on both Disneyland and Walt Disney World in Tomorrowland and some of these futuristic attractions they had. His vision aside, in the practical world of engineering, von Braun strongly preferred the tried and the proven. His conservatism showed also in the matter of rocket propellants. Because of liquid hydrogen's dangerous volatility, he had to be forced into using it as a fuel in Saturn launch vehicle upper stages during Project Apollo. But he readily admitted later that it was the right decision. That was the right decision because of the greater propulsive punch per pound of liquid hydrogen. Likewise, von Braun was ordered to into an all-up launch mode for the Saturn V, starting with the very first unmanned test flight. In other words, if Apollo was going to meet its schedule, that meant, as you know what that term defines, that all three stages had to be flown live from the very start. Von Braun later acknowledged the rightness of that decision too, but his conservatism would have let him take a very incremental approach to that. That same deliberate step-by-step approach by the von Braun team did result, though, in the successful orbiting of America's first space satellite, the Explorer 1, and many more to come. An insistence on perfection also led to an unprecedented 32 successful Saturn launches of various configurations out of 32 attempts. That was unexpected that they would do that well. If von Braun preached and demanded perfection, he did so because long years of experience had taught him that anything else spelled disaster. And he and his team had disasters. When Germany's V2 was ordered prematurely into mass production by the Hitler regime, and the SS took it over, in the autumn of 1943, it was a long time after that before they actually started coming off the production line for operational use. But in the autumn of 43, 6 of every 10 flight test missiles, the V2s, were exploding on the pad or otherwise in flight, and they was ordered into mass production still. Germany could see where the war was going, and it didn't look very good for them. The V2 was not even fired operationally by German troops, army troops, until September 1944. That, of course, came after the Allies' Normandy invasion and after the assassination attempt shortly thereafter on Hitler's life by a group of German army officers. And the German army was rather an apolitical group. They for decades had tried to stay aloof from politics, and unlike the SS, of course. Under the fascist dictatorship, von Braun was indeed a member of the Nazi Party. He did wait, however, for almost 5 years after Hitler came to power to sign up under pressure, the records show, and under what even his critics say was heavy pressure. He accepted, and a lot of people don't know this, an officer's commission, even if it were essentially, but not entirely, honorary, in Heinrich Himmler's brutal SS Corps. Von Braun was, beyond question, an important, if largely anonymous, figure in the Third Reich. He had at least a peripheral connection late in the war with the underground, SS-run, forced labor, death-ridden V2 factory, some 250 miles inland from his Peenemünde base. And yet, incredibly, fairly quickly, he became post-war America's perennial Patriot of the Year and Scientist of the Year, although certainly not in everyone's mind. But that is owing to the guy's brilliance and his charisma and his gregariousness. Unlike some stereotypical, anyway, scientists and engineers, he was extremely outgoing and gregarious, loved being around people of all ilks, and just loved to hear himself talk, I think, and be evangelistic about space. It had not hurt von Braun's case after he and about 120 of his fellow German rocketeers, mostly degreed and multi-degreed engineers and scientists, transferred to the U.S. in 1945-46. That he had been arrested early in 1944 by Himmler's Gestapo secret police, imprisoned on political charges of treason, and placed on trial for his life. This was all, I mean, Himmler knew this not to be true, but it was all a power play on Himmler's part. He had approached von Braun and wooed him to leave the German army and throw in with the SS and let Himmler build his empire further and take over the entire V2 program. It was going to be the wonder weapon that saved Nazi Germany. Von Braun was sprung by order of Hitler during the trial, thanks to intercession by the rocket Wunderkind's commanding general, the Nazi era's Albert Speer, arch enemy of Himmler, on the probably questionable grounds that the V2 program would collapse without von Braun, although he was the heart of it, but it would have gone on. Spies had reported von Braun saying that he was more interested ultimately in exploring space than in developing weapons. Spies like female German dentists who were Gestapo spies, and there were others, in train compartments and at parties in little towns outside of Peenemünde. Spies were everywhere building up dossiers on anybody of any importance, and that was the kind of milieu that you lived in under that dictatorship. Spies had reported his saying he was more interested, I already said that. They had overheard him denigrating certain Nazi bigwigs in what he thought were private settings. And he had also been accused of keeping his fast four-seat Messerschmitt aircraft always gassed up at Peenemünde and handy for an escape to England with all the V2 secrets. Von Braun had been a pilot beginning with gliders at age 19, and he moved pretty quickly into powered aircraft, and he was just a passionate, avid pilot for all of his life, most of his life. As with the R&D problems with the V2, the U.S. Army's Redstone rocket posted a less than perfect performance record early on. This 200-mile range nuclear-capable missile was the first new weapons development project undertaken by the von Braun team in the early 1950s. There were about 5 years that were essentially lost as far as any new developments went. They were firing V2s out in New Mexico and doing research, high altitude research, and teaching Americans how about ballistic missiles. With the Redstone, Launchpad failure followed Launchpad failure for over a period of 3 years of work. Witnessing one catastrophic Redstone explosion at the Cape, pardon me, the scientist's boss Major General H.N. Toftoy, who was the brain behind finding, interrogating, investigating, and finally bringing over to the U.S. this Project Paperclip team of 120 or so German rocket scientists and engineers. But here comes another Redstone Launchpad failure, and Toftoy asked Wernher, why did that rocket explode? And von Braun said the answer must await analysis of data. Toftoy persisted and persisted, finally questioning the German as if he as to whether he had, quote, any idea at all why it exploded. Von Braun fired back. Yes, it exploded because the son of a bitch blew up. Incidentally, von Braun was a very strongly religious man, I think sincerely, in the latter half of his life, and at the same time, again, here's this paradox, he was a champion, world-class cusser in several languages when he was with the boys. He just loved to curse. He had learned long ago, this doesn't have anything to do with cursing, in striving for perfection, that close-knit teamwork and honest communications were the keys to eventual success. A classic example occurred with yet another Redstone test failure in mid-flight. Telemetry data showed all systems had performed well until a precise point. And this enabled the troubleshooters to localize the probable source. The suspected area had been checked and rechecked during lab tests. Finally, the likeliest explanation was accepted and the corrective action was ordered. And von Braun related personally in writing what happened next. There had been a lot of stories going around about this, but I found an account that he had written for a space magazine. An engineer with the firing group asked to see him in his office, and the engineer explained that during pre-launch preps, he had tightened a certain connection, and in so doing had touched a contact and drawn a spark. But since the system checked out well afterward, he had not paid any attention to it. Now that everybody was talking about that particular apparatus, he just wanted von Braun to know. A quick study showed that this was indeed the answer, and the planned remedial action was canceled, and the later test, it turns out, were successful. But Dr. von Braun, immediately after the meeting with the engineer, sent a bottle of very good champagne to the engineer in his office as a gift. He wanted everyone to know that honesty pays off, even at the risk of incriminating oneself. It is only a strong rumor down in Huntsville that von Braun personally helped the engineer dispose of the champagne. But it's a strong rumor. He had an affinity for the grape. In America, von Braun was quite competitive and aggressive in seeking programs, projects, and budget dollars for his organization, whether it was NASA's Marshall Center or earlier with the U.S. Army. The same could be said, of course, of Houston's Robert Gilruth and certain other NASA Field Center directors. Von Braun was a believer in that familiar Shakespearean quote that there is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the crest, leads on to fortune. And and its converse proposition, but he was one to seize the moment, seize the day. The very night that Sputnik went up, The newly designated Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower, Neil McElroy, was visiting at Redstone Arsenal with von Braun and the Army brass there, and they were having a cocktail party before dinner at the Officers Club when news arrived from a London newspaper reporter about Sputnik. Within 1 month, with an awful lot of lobbying, in addition to the access they had to the incoming Secretary of Defense there at this emotional moment, his team got the go-ahead to prepare and launch America's first satellite. JPL was a part of that team, and there were other entities. And in less than 90 days of that order, they did so. Von Braun wanted to vow that they could do it in 60 days, and Medeiros talked him into saying 90 days, change it, and von Braun said, I still believe we can do it in 60. Well, they did it in 89 days. And the weather caused the last 2 or 3 days delay. When NASA was about to be created, von Braun sought to have the lion's share of duties, including astronaut training, based in Huntsville. And when agency roles and missions for the space shuttle were being parceled out, he proposed that almost everything be assigned to Marshall Center, including central program management. Well, NASA headquarters didn't think too highly of that. 2 quick stories shed more light on his management style and philosophy. One involves Marshall's old neutral buoyancy simulator. I think we had some allusion to this earlier. Von Braun had this big water tank built on the sly and on the cheap in the 1960s using in-house welders and funds borrowed from various accounts. By the way, von Braun, from Germany all the way through NASA, and his team were firm believers in a strong in-house R&D capability up to and including prototype fabrication and assembly. And I was so cheered to hear Gus and Ed allude to NASA's currently trying to regain and rebuild that kind of in-house civil service agency capability. I think they were on the right mark there in doing that. This water tank, this 33 by 35 or something feet, had its own, quote, temporary building. Now, all the official literature at Marshall, this was a temporary building they put up. It turned out to be a valuable aid to space flight hardware engineering design, evaluation, and eventually astronaut EVA training, and some cosmonauts trained there. And I think, some underseas explorers trained there. It was also a great public relations boon, a prime visitors attraction at Marshall, especially when any training was going on in the tank, and there were these viewing portals all around. Von Braun had not wanted to go to Congress or go through Congress and endure all the inevitable restrictions that would be put on it, even if he could get approval for the tank. So at the time, he called this huge structure a piece of equipment. It was definitely not a facility. We're into some heavy semantics here. But after a while, he did get caught, and Congress did slap on restrictions, but a lot of use had been made of it. It was a reflection of his philosophy of, quote, better to ask forgiveness than permission. As he told his inner circle, you build the facility first, then you take the slap on the wrist, but you have the facility. They are not going to burn it. Now, I don't know whether y'all want me to promulgate this kind of heresy or not, but that's what was done. Von Braun tended to be a decisive, action-oriented manager. He detested the indecision that can beset bureaucracy. When Hurricane Camille in 1969 ravaged the Gulf of Mexico coast, and the Marshall-managed, then named Mississippi Test Facility, its manager called urgently for help to Huntsville. The Marshall management staffer who was spoken to by the manager suggested that the center send down a team to survey the needs before anything was done. But von Braun said instantly, no, they don't need a survey. They know down there already what they need. Von Braun had his strengths as manager. He was far from perfect. He tended to hold overlong meetings, and he was often slow to reprimand and to discipline anyone. And he was loath to deny his management team unlimited access to him, especially his German-born associates. At one point, 38 managers at Marshall had direct access to him at will in between his weekly board meetings, or at least at will to the point that his confidant and executive secretary, Bonnie Holmes, who was with him for almost 20 years, would allow. She was the gatekeeper and controlled all of that. But he had all these people reporting to him all the time and taking up a lot of his time. An American-born insider finally persuaded him to appoint an R&D overlord to whom the majority would report. After much discussion and over their loud protests, von Braun directed the lab chiefs and others in authority there to choose one from their number. He wanted them to pick their Uber boss, their overlord of R&D managers. And von Braun was going on a holiday trip with his wife, and he said, I won't come back until I see the white smoke of agreement. The team acquiesced after they'd talked themselves out in this very contentious meeting, and they selected Hermann Weidner, a very burly German fellow, for the super chief's role. And thereafter, von Braun would introduce him as my pope, chosen by his cardinals, the lab bosses. There are a number of stories I could tell, but I won't. We'll move on here about Weidner and about von Braun's early and eager practice of MBWA, management by walking around. Whether it was at this 10,000-person Peenemünde facility or his division, his technical operations division with the Army Ballistic Missile Agency got up to around 5,000 people. And at Marshall, the peak civil service employment was close to 8,000. He loved going out into the labs and shops all the time, getting his hands dirty, escaping his tight schedule and his secretary's oversight, and just seeing what the latest thing was, and monitoring the progress of things. But the state-of-the-art research going on within the labs and the work in the shops, wherever he was. He was a hands-on manager. While von Braun may have been a perfectionist in technology development, he fell far short of that in his personal day-to-day life. He had his own set of failings and flaws and foibles and faults. He was a master scuba diver, and Arthur C. Clarke turned the great science fact and fiction writer and Britisher, turned von Braun. He was a great friend of von Braun after the war, turned him on to scuba diving. And he was an avid pilot of anything with wings, and sometimes things without wings, hovercraft, simulators, anything he could fly or control, he loved to do, and he was quite good at it. He got his multi-engine air transport rating. He studied and worked and tested for that, and got that. And he used to fly the Marshall Center Gulfstream, and he flew Learjets and fighter planes, the latest that McDonnell Douglas might have. He'd go to St. Louis at the plant, and while others were having meetings, he'd get with the test pilots in St. Louis and go up in the latest hot jet fighter prototype they had and get to fly it, get checked out, on the spot. In wartime Germany, when the V2, I'm going to try to shorten this. I've got another page and a half to go. I'll see what I can leave out, because I sure don't want to keep you from lunch and go over long here. Despite being this hot jet pilot, he and scuba diver and all this business and all these degrees he had, he was a bona fide klutz as a household handyman. His aristocratic wife, Baroness Maria von Quistorp von Braun, who's alive and well in Alexandria today, is a very slender, mid-70s widow who teaches yoga. She was the family handyman and the banker and the checkbook keeper and did all of that and raised 3 children, became a licensed pilot herself, and was an avid horsewoman, and was quite an interesting lady while he was off doing his thing. Although he wasn't a bad father, he was just absent a lot, but when he was there, he was a pretty good father and husband. In wartime Germany, when the V2 finally flew successfully, in 1943, in October, it finally flew and went up 50 or more miles as the world's first ballistic missile in flight. Hitler made the paradoxical von Braun an honorary research professor. It was a title that von Braun proudly proclaimed in his stationery at Peenemünde, while he never formally taught college anywhere, except for occasional guest lectures on campuses in the U.S., all across the U.S. and abroad. He was nonetheless a teacher most of his life. When a Marshall Center designation visited the Palomar Observatory in the late 60s during the center's design of Skylab to be in part America's first orbiting astronomical observatory, a California University astronomer gave a lecture there at Palomar for this group of visitors on the subject of white dwarfs. This inspired von Braun, as I said, who loved to talk and teach. Later that evening, when they all made their way by trucks, I think, back to Pendleton Marine Camp in California, later that evening, he invited everybody, of course that was a command invitation, to come to his room, and where he gave an all-night lecture on astronomy in general. He talked for hours on astronomy, and that they got 1 or 2 hours of sleep before catching their Gulfstream to go back to Huntsville. And one time in the mid-60s, another Marshall contingent traveling by Learjet across Kansas at 41,000 feet encountered a giant anvil cloud, ANVIL cloud, and they had to fly around it. So enormous. Von Braun left the cockpit, sat down in the cabin beside a young engineer, and proceeded to give him a very learned, detailed lecture on the phenomenon of anvil clouds. He had become quite a meteorological expert, along with a lot of other subjects. That engineer, whom I know and I interviewed, and He's now retired. He remembers that discourse to this day, and he could lecture on the subject himself. Von Braun was so instructive about that phenomenon. And the engineer didn't feel it was a show-off performance. Von Braun just had this knowledge that he had to share, and he wanted this engineer to know what he knew. Von Braun was also quite the politician, and he had many close relationships with national political figures, ranging from President Kennedy to NASA's administrator Tom Paine, among others, to NASA Congressman Olin Tiger Teague, from Texas, Congressman Tiger Teague, who was then chair of the House Space Subcommittee, I think. And then there was Mississippi Senator John Stennis. I know there are people here from the Stennis Space Center who once told Von Braun during a visit at Marshall, he got the grand tour, that he looked at Von Braun and said, "I don't really care about all these nice facilities and capabilities and programs you have at Marshall, Doctor, as long as nothing is ever, I repeat, ever taken away from Mississippi." And of course, the center in Mississippi now bears the Stennis name. But and Stennis remained a staunch NASA supporter through all his years in the Senate. Von Braun worked at cultivating personal political relationships. He was a willing, enthusiastic, and straight-shooting witness before Congress, and he went on countless hunting trips with politician friends, Teague and many others. He rolled out the red carpet for grand tours of Marshall when they came to see him there, and he invited them often to come there. And he made the ultimate sacrifice by joining them on some rollicking evenings in New Orleans' French Quarter after visits to the Marshall-managed Michoud assembly facility there. 40 years later, given his past in Nazi Germany, it was unknown how the image of this human paradox would fare in the 21st century. Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine, which, by the way, in the issue before last, I was so thrilled to see a full-page, extremely generous review of Dr. Space in the February 27th issue, a number of months after publication. But Av Week coordinated a worldwide survey in 2003 for the centennial of man's first powered flight, despite what the other inventor, I forget the name, it starts with L. Oh, Langley. What, Langley, yeah. No, I'm sorry. Who was it?
Oh, Pierpont and Langley.
Oh, yes, Pierpont and Langley. And this survey was to determine internationally the, quote, top 100 stars of aerospace history. In excess of 1 million ballots came in from industry professionals in 180 countries. And how did Von Braun rate? The results revealed at the Paris Air Show and in the magazine that June put him first among world space figures, even ahead of Armstrong and Jules Verne and Goddard and Shepard and all the rest. And in the overall category of aerospace, he came in second in this survey, behind only the Wright brothers. So I guess his stature is, among this group of voters anyway, was holding up pretty well. Among the more than 100 people I interviewed for the book, I was going to go through a laundry list of shameless name dropping here, and I won't do that. I mentioned that Pickering, Dr. Pickering gave me he's now a fallen hero, gave me a wonderful, insightful interview. Actually, we had two interviews, as did John Glenn and Hugh Downs and Walter Cronkite, and a lot of people that are still living, but a great number have passed on in the 7 years or 8 years since I began work on this. Walter Cronkite, there I go again. He was a great friend and admirer of von Braun, and he compared von Braun to Columbus. He said that just as 500 years later, we remember Columbus's voyages of discovery from that century, people 500 years from now will remember the Apollo missions to the moon as the crowning achievement of the 20th century. And Cronkite observed that while Earthlings of the 25th century will undoubtedly fixate on the daring exploits of Armstrong, Aldrin, Collins, and the other lunar astronauts, as they should, Apollo's engineers will be remembered as well. I have one more sentence, or one more paragraph. Mr. Cronkite added, people then, 5 centuries from now, will recognize Apollo as an engineering feat. And when they do, he said, they will fixate on von Braun as certainly one of the greatest space engineering pioneers of all time. It has been a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you, and I suspect we don't have any time for questions. Thank you.